Of the various third-party controller manufacturers that I've covered, one of my favorites has been 8BitDo, or 8BitDo, whichever way you want to pronounce it. I swear they rebranded at some point. Anyways, the point is, I've enjoyed a lot of their controllers, especially a lot of the unlicensed ones that they've done for Nintendo. And lately, they've been churning out a lot of new designs that are officially licensed for Xbox. They had a wireless design that was meant to be used with phones for cloud streaming. They released an Xbox version of the Pro 2 that was a wired controller, and now they have the ultimate wired controller for Xbox. Truth be told, the Ultimate Wired Controller is really 80–90% the same thing as the Pro 2, but with the very important difference of having a physical redesign that reflects something much more like a traditional Xbox controller, rather than the kind of Nintendo PlayStation fusion that the Pro 2 has going on. This includes some pretty obvious physical redesigns like the general grip shape, using offset sticks instead of symmetrical sticks, but there are some other subtle adjustments as well, including how a lot of the buttons are shaped. So I'm going to go over everything this controller has to offer, what differentiates it from the Pro 2, and what differentiates it from the official Xbox controller as well, and ultimately just whether or not it's worth your money. Full disclosure, this is not a sponsored video, but the controller was sent out to me as free product for the purposes of reviewing. So first off, the general overview, this is a $45 MSRP controller that is designed primarily with Xbox in mind, but does also work on PC. It is a hardwired design, so you do have to plug it in. There is no wireless support, and the cable itself is not removable, which is always a thing that's a bit of a give and take. Part of me appreciates the fact that I'm just always going to have the cable on hand, and there's no way for me to lose it by separating them and then it getting tangled in with a bunch of other cables. But at the same time, it is a lot more transportable to be able to separate them and store them away that way. Button control layout is all very familiar. Set of offset sticks. We've got a more traditional D-pad as opposed to the faceted D-pad on an Xbox controller. ABXY, shoulder buttons, home button, share button for Xbox. Where we get into things that are a little different is the addition of a pair of remappable buttons on the back with the handles, and a little heart button which is used for profile swapping as well as syncing to the 8BitDo Ultimate software, and a little star button in the middle right here that's used for on-the-fly remapping. Like official Xbox controllers, the Ultimate wired controller does also feature an auxiliary port that does also include an onboard mute button. So if you're using a pair of headphones that don't really have an easily conveniently accessible mute feature, you can just do that right from the controller by flipping the switch right here. Also worth noting, this controller does come in a couple different color options. This is the black one right here, but they do also make it in a white, and as part of Xbox's kind of springtime celebration they were doing, they've also released a pastel pink design, though it does still feature a lot of black trim for the buttons. Feature-wise, without using their Ultimate software, really the only major thing you're getting is the ability to do the on-the-fly remapping with the star button, which is a little weird. Basically, this just lets you immediately swap two specific buttons, and it's got to be the traditional ones. It actually does not apply to these back handle ones right here. So for instance, let's say that for whatever reason in a specific game that doesn't give you in-game remapping, you really wish that the B button did what the A button does and vice versa. You can do that by holding down the A button, holding down the B button, and then pressing that star icon. That causes them to swap places, and if you want to swap them back, you just do the same thing all over again. It's a handy option to have this available on the fly, but honestly, this is not my favorite way of handling it. It's honestly a lot better to use the Ultimate software, which sadly does not have a native Xbox app version that you can use just through the system itself, but things have been made at least a little more accessible by allowing you to use it not only on a PC, but also using their app that is available on iPhone and Android. Despite the fact this is a wired controller specifically for Xbox, you do have the ability to have it wirelessly communicate with the app in order to do various different forms of customization. This includes being able to do full different profiles that allow for different remappings, what you want to map those back buttons to, the ability to adjust the vibration, stick sensitivity, all that good stuff, giving you a pretty good amount of freedom for fine-tuning how you want this controller to work. While an app native to Xbox itself would be really nice to have, using the phone connectivity is honestly really simple. I haven't had any bad experiences using it. I just open up the app, hit the button on the controller, and they connect immediately, and I'm able to remap it or change settings how I want. Now again, in terms of how features and everything works out, this is basically the same thing as their already released Pro 2. What really differentiates it is, again, that focus on a more Xbox style design that honestly, I've found myself really preferring. I've always enjoyed the Pro 2 and its kind of DualShock 4 4 style design, which is comfortable, but generally, just personally, I've enjoyed the feeling of Xbox controllers more, and so this finding that kind of midpoint that mixes them, I really appreciate. The grip design, while not the same as Xbox controllers, is still really comfortable. It uses that offset stick design instead of symmetrical, which I do personally like better, but that absolutely is a kind of personal preference thing. And the shoulder buttons, while still having a little bit in common, especially with the DualShock 4 design for the triggers, overall does feel a lot more like an Xbox design. When compared to the official Xbox controller, there's really 3 main things this brings to the table. Price point, D-pad, back buttons. First off, price point, at $45, it is cheaper than the MSRP of an Xbox wired controller. Arguably, it's not that hard to find an official Xbox wireless controller at that price point, or maybe even lower if you're willing to go used, so it's a little bit of a trade-off. It is a little frustrating, the fact that because this is an officially licensed controller, it is a little more expensive relative to 8BitDo's other products. For instance, if you look at their official Pro 2 controller for Switch, that is a $50 controller, this is $5 cheaper and is wired only. Still though, if you're not generally trying to hunt down deals and you're just going to find the easiest, fastest way of buying the controller, this is cheaper than the average Xbox controller at list price. What really ends up being the big selling points though is the D-pad and these back buttons. D-pads have always been one of the really big strengths for the 8BitDo controllers, mainly because it just feels a lot like an old school one and captures that style perfectly. I find that the faceted D-pad on the brand new Xbox controllers works really well for a lot of modern games, but the moment that I want to play something that's a retro throwback that's been ported to the Xbox, or I'm playing a retro game on PC, I'm playing some kind of level editor game that's meant to handle like a retro game, if I want to use the D-pad primarily for movement and playing those kind of old school games, the D-pad on the Ultimate wired controller does feel a lot more like home than the faceted D-pad on an Xbox controller does. And then as for the remappable back buttons, this is a fairly standard feature you see on most third-party controllers these days, so much so that I'm actually really surprised we just didn't see official first-party controllers embrace this just yet, outside of, you know, the really expensive Pro Elite controller type of stuff. It's just a really nice feature to have if you want to keep both your thumbs on sticks as long as possible, not even necessarily for pro competitive type situations, which they're traditionally aimed towards. One example that comes up a lot for me personally is that when I'm playing a Souls-like game, most recently Elden Ring, it's really nice to have one of the back buttons be mapped to B. That way I have the ability to run, move, and change camera direction all at the same time, which you can't do with the regular layout. All that being said, there are some things about the controller that when compared to the official option, I do prefer the official one. First off, obviously a big one is that you have the ability to do wireless or a dedicated wired connection, not wired only. I also don't really love the vibration on the Ultimate Pro controller. The lower motor ones feel fine, but the higher motor ones are just this especially higher pitched feeling fast vibration that just doesn't really feel the same as the official one, and honestly just kind of feels wrong to me. I find myself turning off those motors and focusing on just the lower ones for most of my gameplay. After the past week of using the Ultimate wired controller as just my go-to for playing stuff on Xbox, I gotta say I really walked away with it now being probably my favorite cheaper wired option for the Xbox. Ultimately, I still find myself going to a traditional wireless controller when I have that option. Of course, doing what I do, I have access to a number of different Pro controllers that are great to use, but if you're looking for something that offers just a pair of back buttons and a more traditional D-pad, that really is, I think, the strongest selling points this controller has. There's other stuff about it that's fine. There are, of course, those additional features that you can adjust with the Ultimate software, which Xbox does offer a lot with their original controllers anyways. There's a lot about it that is also really interesting. You do get some of those additional Pro controller style features like being able to adjust stick and trigger sensitivity, but ultimately I think the really big selling point of this is you want a retro style D-pad and a pair of remappable buttons. While it is relatively a little more expensive than some of their other not officially licensed controllers, I think at $45 you're still getting a lot of bang for your buck. If it wasn't for the fact that I just had access to more expensive Pro controllers, I could definitely see this becoming one of my main go-to options, if not on Xbox, definitely on PC, because again, I really do enjoy having those remappable back buttons for certain titles, and if I want to play retro stuff, the D-pad just feels right. So those are my thoughts on the Ultimate wired controller. If you are interested in grabbing one, I have a link down below in the description if you want to grab one. As always, if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button to let me know. If you didn't, hit that thumbs down as well, because it's always good info for me to have, even though you guys can't see the like ratio, I still do. And if you want to make sure to see even more content, make sure to subscribe, hit that bell icon, and I will see you guys later.